Stanley Johnson, welcome to Personality Politics and thank you for joining us.
Well, delighted to be here.
Let's talk about your upbringing to start with. You were born in Cornwall, you went to Sherborne Public School, then Oxford, a very traditional upper class English background, if I could put it like that. But your family is actually quite cosmopolitan, isn't it? You're the son of Osman Kamal, later known as Wilfred Johnson, a Turk, and your grandfather was a Turkish government minister assassinated in the 1920s. And I think your maternal grandmother's line was German as well.
Actually, there's a pretty heavy German element there. But at a certain point towards the end of the 19th century, the von Pfeffels became de Pfeffel. And they came originally from South Germany, but another branch came from Colmar, where of course there was a constant trade between France and Germany. Anyway, the de Pfeffels, my mother's grandfather, Christian Hubert de Pfeffel, bought a lovely house in Versailles, which was once the Pavillon du Barry, would you believe it? And my mother was born there. So actually, oddly enough, I'm at the moment applying to what's called assert my French nationality. It's quite a complicated business. But yes, there's the French element, there's the Turkish element, there's the English element. My great grandfather on my mother's side was actually called Sir George Williams, and he founded the YMCA. Not to be confused with the song of that name. I'm talking about the organization, if you see what I mean.
You are a rainbow of European talent. Should we put it like that? Let's talk about your political formations then. Do you remember how you first voted? When did politics first come into your life?
Yes, I remember that very clearly. It was in it was in the 1952, the October 1952 election. I don't think you'll remember. I don't even think your father will remember it. But I was at prep school in darkest Devon, or sunniest Devon, but actually it was the one on the top of rather grim piece of moorland, grim in winter anyway. And Churchill was standing for elections. For election, I think it was the second. I think there were two elections that year, 1952. Anyway, this was the October election, and I thought how wonderful it was. I was about 10 years old at the time at prep school. How wonderful it was when he became prime minister. And I wrote him a letter. I said, "Dear sir, dear Mr. Churchill, I'm so pleased that you've become prime minister. You did such a wonderful job." And I got a wonderful letter back from his one of his principal assistants, saying the Prime Minister has commanded me to thank you for your letter. I got into terrible trouble with my headmaster because he intercepted this letter. And he said at school press, "Will the boy who's been writing to number 10 Downing Street please come and see me?" Which was always a very worrying moment, as you know, that kind of thing. Anyway, he let me off. He said, "You've been writing unauthorized letters to the Prime Minister. The whole government of the country will come to a stop if boys at prep school start writing to the Prime Minister." I still have that letter. I can tell you, I was thrilled by it.
I think you were about 12 at the time, if I had done the maths correctly.
I was about 12, maybe 11 actually. And for me, I think it was really Churchill more than the Conservatives. Although since I was growing up in the middle of Exmoor, right in the middle of Exmoor, my father was a farmer. I don't think there was much chance of my following the Labour road. Although I will tell you that in my little village of Winsford, this was the place where Ernest Bevin was born and brought up. I tell you, and there's a little plaque on this little cottage in Winsford. It says Ernest Bevin, statesman, lived here.
So you became a Tory because of Winston Churchill, is that right?
I would say because of that, and because of the general background, and because down in my part of the world, which was Exmoor. Okay, there is a liberal tradition, but the liberal tradition wasn't actually in that part of West Somerset. It was more to the west, more in Devon and Cornwall, I'd say, than West Somerset. So there, yes, but for me, also when I came back from America, because I started life in America. I worked for the World Bank. I worked for the United Nations. But again, looking at this election scene, okay, so if the October 52 election was vital in my formation, I would say also the June 1970 election because before the June 1970 election, I came back and I was given a job in the Conservative Research Department as the first environmental officer of the Conservative Research Department. Now, those early 1970s, they were very, very exciting days for environmentalists. They really were. It was the build-up to the first Stockholm Conference, for example, 1972. We produced the Tories came out with a manifesto, and in that manifesto, check it out, you will see, I'm talking about the June 1970 election manifesto, good stuff about the environment. I wrote it with Mr. Heath, and we said we're going to have clean air, clean water. Conservatives are natural conservationists, etymologically speaking, and in many other ways.
Well, Stanley, you're well known for a couple of things. We were going to talk about those. One, of course, is your love for conservation and the environment. So I was going to ask you where it all began. It would appear it all began there. It began because you were given a job on the environment desk in Tory Central Office, or because you always liked the environment before then? Which was first?
It began years and years before that. I mean, it began because I grew up, and I've still got the farm today. 70 years on, I'm still living in the same house where I grew up, pretty much, and I've still got my prep school tuck box. And when you live in the heart of one of the most beautiful valleys on Exmoor, with deer, with heron, with kingfishers, it'd be very difficult not to be an environmentalist. And then also the application of one's intelligence. Frankly, is there anything else to be? I asked myself, and I asked myself that long before I got my first job in the World Bank, long before I joined the United Nations. I can remember at Oxford, it was perfectly obvious to me that the environmental issue was fundamentally important.
The other thing, of course, you're being well known for is your Europeanism. You were a member of the European Parliament for 5 years, 1979 to 1984. You worked for the EU Commission before. Why have you always been such a fervent, passionate pro-European? Is it your genetic makeup, perhaps, or some philosophy?
Well, the genetic makeup, I think, does come into it. Not that the Turkish side, they were an early applicant to be a member of the European community, but they haven't got there yet. Obviously, the French side was there. It was also, I think, my sense that this was a venture worth embarking on, and I can absolutely remember must have been in the very beginning of 1973. Britain, if you remember, joined January 1, 1973. We were accepted, I think, 1971 maybe, but there was a preparatory period. And I can actually remember getting a telephone call from the Civil Service Commission saying, well, your name has been put forward to be head of the new European Commission's newly established Prevention of Pollution Division. Well, who wouldn't go for that sort of job? So I wouldn't say I was deeply engaged in quote unquote the European project then. For me, the excitement was to be able to work on environmental policy at a more than one country level, on the grounds that perfectly obviously environment crosses so many borders. It's not just a one country issue.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I was also going to ask you about China, because you've also become quite well known of late to defend keeping links with the Chinese. I think you had a relationship with the former Chinese ambassador. You passed messages from him to the British government. And that's because, is it right that you believe China is a hugely important player on the world stage for the environment, for climate change, and only by engaging with China can you get results?
Well, that absolutely. Both those propositions are totally correct. Number one, China is a huge player on the climate change. I mean, the good news is that China has now said is going to reach net zero carbon by 2060. That's already a progress. The challenge, it will be to get it to advance that date to 2050 or whatever. Now, that's, of course, the first of your question. Second, it makes an entire sense at a political level to work with China. From a personal point of view, China has been something I've been following for years and years and years. In 1961, for example, with Tim Severin, who last died a couple of months ago, we set off on motorcycles to try and follow Marco Polo's route from Venice to China. Marco Polo, of course, went on camels. We didn't get all the way there, but I was one of the very first delegations from the EU way back in 1975 to go to China. Two of my novels, I've written masses of novels, the 11th had just come out, but 2 or even 3 of them are based in China. I had Dragon River and I had the Doomsday Deposit. So yes, and one of my sons Max Johnson, lived. He actually went and got a degree in China at Tsinghua University, and he's still out in Asia as I speak. So yes, China for me is absolutely not a bête noire in any way. It is the key to so many things. In strictly political terms now, of course, it's absolutely vital that we work very closely with China, not just for the Glasgow conference, but at the same time we're working towards the Kunming conference, and the Kunming conference not getting the same amount of publicity as the Glasgow conference, but it's to do with nature protection. And you can't actually deliver climate change if the loss of biodiversity continues at the rate it is. Do you see? Because at least 30% of what you need to deal with climate change is going to be found in the forests and in the hills and in the mountains.
There is also a flip side to China, though, of course, which you're well aware of, and that's the security aspect. And it's also known that China indulges in mass-scale industrial espionage. They steal secrets, they hack, and all their intentions to us are not altogether positive. And a lot of Tory MPs think that. They put another of your sons, Boris, under a lot of pressure over this. He's just pulled out a new national security strategy to try and deal with China, but with wariness. Do you think he's got that balance right? Because it's a difficult one, isn't it?
I think it is a very difficult one. I read the paper, the 100-page paper. I think he is right not to write off China at this point. On the contrary, I think he's right to move, to discussions with China, important discussions. This is inevitable, even more inevitable now that we have left the EU. But yes, of course, you're right. Also on this, on the security side and the Huawei side, that makes a lot of sense.
Because the accusation is it's naive. So the idea that we can generally engage and change China, I think Alex Younger, the former chief of MI6, said that was for the birds. And unless you show strength is the only thing Beijing recognises.
Well, I don't think we're going to do that. I don't think there's any way in which we can, as it were, match China weapon for weapon. I don't think that makes any sense at all. We are going to engage with China at an intellectual level. Look at the number of Chinese students at British universities today. Can you imagine the effect on British universities, even the financial effect on British universities, if we had a rupture now with the Chinese? I mean, a lot of them would just go out of business. That they are so dependent on Chinese students, Chinese research, and so on and so forth. So I feel quite strong. Now, I've got a lot of respect for people like John Tugendhat. Don't think I haven't. But I would be worried by a tendency in the Tory party to suddenly, cook up. Maybe they'll be distracted now by Ursula von der Leyen. You see, maybe their aggressive instincts can be redirected to Brussels at this point in time.
Your advice to your son is stand up to those Tory voices saying, turn your back on China.
Yes, that would absolutely be my case. I've found them always. There's a wonderful moment. You mentioned this, my dealings with the Chinese ambassador. Well, I went with a lovely gentleman who was head of the RSPB, and we went to talk to him really about the important link between biodiversity and climate change. And we ended up by talking about the importance of mud as a carbon absorber. And it turns out that an acre of mud, absorbs far more, millions and thousands of times more carbon than an acre of rainforest. I'm not saying we don't need the rainforest. Anyhow, we ended up by singing the Flanders and Swan song. Mud, glorious mud. It was a wonderful moment. After that, unfortunately, COVID broke out, so we didn't get to the final verse, which I was very much looking forward to.
You sang this with the Chinese?
We sang it with the Chinese ambassador in these wonderful suite rooms and his staff and things. Mud, glorious mud. There's nothing quite like it for cooling the blood. I wanted to get onto this follow me, follow, because I thought it'd be interesting, but we didn't quite get onto that.
Had you taken drink, Stanley? Was this just good?
No, not at all. Not at all. It was bonhomie. We were having a very, very good, and he's a brilliant man, by the way. He was called Liu Kaoming, and we're waiting now for the new Chinese ambassador. Currently, the Chinese chargé d'affaires is that I've not been writing her letters because I can't work out whether you should do acute E when you're writing to the chargé d'affaires, or do you see what I mean? Or would you drop the final E when it's a lady? So I'm in a little bit of a dilemma, and I'm holding on for some professional advice on this point.
I'm sorry, I can't help with that. Another, of course, of your political legacies to the world is your children. You've had incredibly successful children. Of course, Boris is Prime Minister, but Joe also was a prominent Conservative Minister, MP, now peer. Rachel, prominent political activist as well as author and writer. You've got six children in total, and broadcaster for a radio station that we won't go into. But Stanley, your children are known for their ferocious competitiveness and success. Why have you managed to breed such a successful, interesting bunch?
Do you know something? I think, insofar as what you say might be true, I don't think I have inculcated. By the way, it's not often you have a chance to use the word inculcated, and I'd just like you to check, Tom, when you last had an interview where he used that word. That's aside that point. It came to me. I didn't inculcate any kind of competitiveness in them, but what I did do is do the thing which British people like me, English people like me, if they're lucky enough to be able to afford it, and I was lucky enough, I sent them off to good schools. Simple as that. And at the time they were doing their education, competition was not a bad word. I think maybe it's changed now in schools. I'm not followed it in detail, but in my day, for example, I used to write letters home from this prep school. I mentioned this prep school, dear mummy and daddy. They were short letters. My marks this week were 148. I came top. We beat St Albans 15 love. That was it. That was it. I mean, competition was the name of the game.
Let me also put this to you. You are a passionate defender of your oldest son, Boris. You've disagreed passionately over things like Brexit in the past, but you very publicly, you always defend him. It's a good attribute to have, I'm sure. But do you think he needs that defence? Because some say he's an interesting character, doesn't do everything right. Do you think he gets too much of a hard time? Is that why you defend him?
Well, I'm not sure. Do I passionately defend him? I've just said all the things to you. I've said in public. This is why I will back the government now in its. However, I'll give you an example where I might have not passionately defended him. The other day, the government appeared to be quite relaxed about Cumbria going ahead with this coal mine. So I went on BBC News. I went on the 6 o'clock news, and I said the same thing again on the 10 o'clock news. Actually, I think it wasn't. I think they just repeated the interview. And so there it was that I was taking a clearly antagonistic line, because the government at that point, at any rate, was pro the Cumbria coal mine, or at least pro not intervening in what they call a local decision. Take the climate changes to which we are on now. Okay, at the moment, I think the government's got it right, and we've got to push very, very hard. But if it came, for example, to a question of carbon taxes, I think we would absolutely need to go down that route. And if the government suddenly said, so sorry, we cannot go into the aspect of cross-border carbon taxes, which is fundamental if you're going to have to deal with climate change, I think I would then stand up. Now, luckily, Tom, I am the ambassador for the Conservative Environment Network, who support all these sort of things, which may be a little bit in advance of thinking.
Stan, let me bring in Gloria, who wants to talk to you too.
Oh. Has there ever been an election which you haven't voted for the Conservative Party?
Well, there was an election in my college for the chairman of the junior, what's it called?
Common Room.
Yeah, junior common room. Yeah, exactly, JCR. And I voted for someone who was not a Conservative on that occasion, because it wasn't a particularly political. So yes, there have been elections where I haven't voted for the Conservative Party. They're JCR type elections, but otherwise, no. I would instinctively vote for the Conservative. Mind you, that's just the way it is. I mean, if you like, it's a kind of tribalism there comes in, I think.
Tell me what you don't like about socialism.
Well, now this is a bit interesting, mainly because socialism bosses people around. Now, you could say, funny to say that now, when, of course, every movement we make now is totally controlled. But I think this is an aberration, and we're going to go beyond this period. But yes, in a nutshell, Gloria, what I don't like about socialism is the way you can be bossed around, and, if you like, every last movement controlled by the powers that be.
Stanley, normally we sum you up around this time at the end of the interview, but I think it's quite clear and everyone knows very well you are a compassionate, conservationist, very loyal to your children Conservative. Would you agree?
I am. Now, if Rachel had pursued with her career, I can't remember which party she joined. The last election, I think several. Several. I think several. Anyway, I'm sure I would have found a way of supporting her somehow.
Stanley Johnson, thank you so much for giving us your personality politics.
And thank you, Tom, and thank you, Gloria.